Dozens feared dead in Pakistan. This after a Pakistani International Airlines flight crashes in a crowded neighborhood of Karachi seconds before landing. Outrage in Hong Kong after China unveils plans to impose a new security law. Pro-democracy activists say it spells the end of the one country, two systems policy in place. And arrivals in the UK will need to quarantine for 2 weeks from the 8th of June. The rules to limit the spread of the coronavirus will apply to all countries except Ireland. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. First, a plane carrying 98 people on board has crashed before landing in Karachi this Friday. Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 went down in a crowded neighborhood near the city's airport. At least 2 people have been pulled out alive, and it's unclear how many people on the ground have been injured. James Wilson reports.
On Friday afternoon, the sky above the Pakistani city of Karachi was filled with black smoke after an Airbus A320 crashed, having failed to land at the nearby airport.
तो ऐसी नॉइज़ आई जैसे कोई चीज़ रगड़ती हुई ऊपर से बहुत ज़ोर से गिरी है, नीचे गिर रही है और ऐसा फील हो रहा था कि जैसे एकदम से ज़लज़ला सा कोई चीज़ आ गई है।
तो मैंने छत से देखा काफ़ी ज़्यादा धुआं निकल रहा था, तो मैं फिर वहाँ से घर से भाग के इधर काज़माबाद की साइड पे आया। तो फिर इधर एक घर से गुजर के तो इधर आया, तो यहाँ पे कॉकपिट गिरा हुआ था, उसमें से एक तो किसी पायलट की कैप्टन की लाश पड़ी थी। फिर इधर से
On board were close to 100 passengers and crew members on their way from Lahore to Karachi. After a failed attempt to land, air traffic control received a distress call from the pilot.
आवाज़ सुनी है पायलट साहब की, वो ये कह रहे थे कि मुझे टेक्निकल प्रॉब्लम है और उन्होंने फाइनल अप्रोच से उनको कहा गया कि दोनों रनवे लैंडिंग के लिए तैयार हैं, आप के लिए लैंड कर सकते हैं.
Aviation authorities suspect the plane was unable to open its wheels before landing, but have stressed it is too soon to be sure. Emergency services have recovered scores of bodies and at least 2 passengers survived, according to the country's health department. And as the plane landed in a densely populated area of Karachi, there are fears that a number of locals have died as well.
There has been a swift international condemnation to a proposed new security law for Hong Kong. Pro-democracy lawmakers say the bill will mark the end of the one country, two systems policy. The bill, which is set to be approved by Beijing's parliament next week, would criminalize any act of secession, subversion or interference by a foreign power. Catherine Viet reports.
The end of one country, two systems. That's what some lawmakers in Hong Kong are saying after Beijing announced plans to enact national security laws for the city. After scuffles broke out at Hong Kong's Legislative Council, Chief Executive Carrie Lam said her government would cooperate with Beijing and the new law would not affect people's rights, freedoms, or judicial independence.
The important thing is for the people of Hong Kong to realize that without protection of national security, many of the things that we enjoy, many of the things that we treasure will be lost. So this is really the time for us not to waste any more time and to get on with this important legislative safeguards.
Pro-democracy activists are already calling for big protests.
We must continue the fight in such uphill battle against the national security law, just like how we successfully forced the government to withdraw the controversial extradition bill in 2019.
The semi-autonomous region is technically obliged to enact national security legislation. It attempted to do so in 2003, but widespread protest forced officials to shelve it. The Chinese government says the bill would prohibit terrorism, foreign interference, secession, and subversion. Beijing's latest push for more control over Hong Kong comes after last year's wave of sometimes violent pro-democracy protests. The demonstrations were sparked by a bill that would have allowed extraditions to mainland China. Protests continued even after the bill was withdrawn and were stifled only by anti-coronavirus restrictions.
Now, the government here in France has announced that the second round of local elections will be held on the 28th of June. The first round took place before the country entered a lockdown to prevent the spread of COVID-19 back in March. The French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe said after weighing the pros and cons, democratic life must resume.
These election posters will stay up for at least another month. France on Friday confirmed the date for a second round of local elections, originally due to be held on March 22nd, but postponed due to the coronavirus pandemic.
After having weighed up the pros and cons, we think that democratic life also needs to resume. This is why on the 27th of May we will present a decree to the President calling on voters to go to the polls for the second round of local elections on the 28th of June.
The elections could be postponed again if the outbreak worsens, and officials will reassess the situation in 2 weeks. The first round was held on March 15, just days before France was ordered into lockdown, a move that drew criticism over possible health risks and sending mixed signals about staying at home. This time, the government wants to avoid any fallout and insists several precautions will be put in place.
Each voter must wear a mask, which may be a mask for the general public, and must also have access to alcoholic gel or to water for washing their hands.
Out of France's 35,000 municipalities, about 30,000, mostly smaller villages, elected their mayor in the first round. Larger cities, including Paris, Lyon and Marseille, are among the 5,000 remaining. The government had considered postponing the second round up until January 2021. But if it was held after this June, both the first and second rounds would need to be redone in the 5,000 cities and towns. Candidates will be hoping for a higher turnout this time, after the first round attracted just 45% of voters.
It's time now for a look at today's business news, and we start out with a look at the markets. First up, Wall Street. On a mixed note this Friday, there you can see the Dow Jones ending the session completely flat, while the Nasdaq was up 0.4%. It was a similar picture here in Europe as investors grapple with the uncertainty surrounding the coronavirus pandemic. Now, here in France, the country's finance minister is warning the economy still faces a rough path to recovery. For more on that story, we can go across to France 24's Cole Stangler from our business desk. Good evening, Cole. Bruno Le Maire suggesting the tough times will be continuing.
That's right. He said earlier that, quote, there will be bankruptcies and there will be layoffs in the months to come. That coming from a radio interview that he gave on Friday morning. French economy, of course, has been hit especially hard by the coronavirus pandemic. Just the first 3 months of this year, we've seen GDP slump by around 6%. That's the highest such toll since records began in the late 1940s. A steeper slump than even what we're seeing in neighboring Germany, which Germany has lost its 2.2% of GDP, and those losses, of course, expected to continue into the second quarter of the year. At the same time, Bruno Le Maire defending the French government's response, defending the spending that's gone into propping up the French economy, some 450 billion euros. A key part of that is the expansion of what's known as the partial unemployment system. Now, essentially, that's paying businesses to keep workers on payroll as opposed to laying them off. A contrast to what we've seen in the United States, where those measures are not in place, and you see the unemployment rate spiked considerably, around 14%, highest level since the Depression. Bruno Le Maire is saying that he was, quote, proud of the French model for keeping, for providing the kind of response we've seen in the United States. At the same time, Le Maire is saying that partial unemployment system will need to be updated in the months ahead as the economy, as the government aims to keep the economy, aims to reopen the economy, excuse me.
But Cole, he also warned that the future of French car maker Renault could be at stake.
That's right. Actually issuing a very explicit warning here, saying that, quote, Renault could disappear. Bruno Le Maire also saying it's important to stay clear-headed. Now, of course, the auto sector has suffered overall as a result of the downturn, but Renault in particular has been hit hard. Earlier this week, there were reports that Renault could be forced to close 4 plants here in France, 3 plants, closing 3 plants and restructuring another one. Renault has also asked for a €5 billion loan from the French government. Bruno Le Maire is saying that he has not yet signed off on that loan, and any aid going to Renault will be part of a larger package to the auto industry that's expected to come next week. But the French government also wants to be sure that any aid that goes out to the auto industry does come with some strings attached. Now, the two key pieces of that in exchange for that loan would be boosting environmental standards, making more environmentally friendly cars. Another key portion of it would be some sort of relocating supply chains back in France. So we'll have to see how that plays out, and we'll be looking ahead towards next week when the French government is going to formally introduce that auto sector relief plan.
Cool. Thank you very much for that, Cole Sangler there. Now, people arriving in the United Kingdom from next month will need to quarantine for 2 weeks or risk an unlimited fine. The rules, which go into effect from the 8th of June, will apply to arrivals from all countries except Ireland. Britain did not close its borders during the worst of the country's coronavirus outbreak, and the latest announcement comes as its European neighbours begin to open up.
We will conduct spot checks by mid-June to ensure that people are self-isolating. And those from overseas who refuse to comply could be refused entry. Public Health England will set up an assurance service to contact people at random to ensure that they understand the requirements and to also ensure that they are self-isolating.
Donald Trump is calling on governors in the United States to reopen churches and other houses of worship. The U.S. president has deemed such places as essential. Trump said if governors don't abide by his request, he would override them. However, it's unclear if the president has the authority to do so.
Some governors have deemed liquor stores and abortion clinics as essential, but have left out churches and other houses of worship. It's not right. So I'm correcting this injustice and calling houses of worship essential. I call upon governors to allow our churches and places of worship to open right now. If they don't do it, I will override the governors.
Now, there are fears Brazil could become the new epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. The president, Jair Bolsonaro, has repeatedly dismissed the seriousness of COVID-19 and continues to call for an end of lockdown measures. The virus is hitting Brazil's indigenous population particularly hard, and the mayor of the largest city in the Amazon rainforest is warning of a genocide if the government fails to change course. Wasim Corne reports.
Local authorities in Brazil's Amazon region are sounding the alarm over what they say is the abandonment of the country's indigenous people in the face of the coronavirus pandemic. In an online video, the mayor of Manaus, the largest city in the state of Amazonas, called the government's failure to act a crime against humanity.
Eu temo genocídio e quero denunciar essa coisa ao mundo inteiro. Ao mundo inteiro. Nós temos aqui governo que não liga para a vida dos índios.
The state of Amazonas is home to less than 2% of Brazil's population, but so far it has recorded more than 8% of the country's national death toll. And indigenous people are bearing the brunt of the effects of COVID-19. These aerial pictures show mass graves dug in the city of Manaus. According to local organizations, 38 ethnic groups, including tribes located in rural areas, have been hit by the pandemic. In an effort to help diagnose cases, 200 rapid testing kits have been sent to the city. But when it comes to patients with serious cases of coronavirus, doctors are faced with little choice but to airlift them to larger hospitals.
Vários deles não têm ventilador mecânico. A equipe está no Ambu fazendo ventilação manual, 2 dias, 3 noites sem parar, às vezes até sem muita indicação de remoção devido à gravidade, mas se deixar lá ia morrer, então
To make matters worse, deforestation of the Amazon is also ramping up. Since the beginning of the pandemic, wood cutting and the illegal extraction of minerals has increased. NGOs say Jair Bolsonaro's racist and anti-indigenous rhetoric is partly to blame.
Wasim Corne reporting there. That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching.